You know what hurts the most? Sitting at that mahogany dining table, listening to my own children argue about fairness and inheritance, while they have no idea that Grandma Rose's trust fund letter is folded neatly in my purse, just 3 feet away from their greedy little hands. I'm Margaret, 67 years old, and I've spent the last 40 years of my life being the family's invisible workhorse. While my husband built his career, I raised 3 ungrateful children, took care of his ailing mother for 15 years, and somehow managed to keep this suburban Connecticut household running like clockwork. The white colonial house with its perfectly manicured lawn became my prison, and I became the ghost that kept it functioning. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., I'd wake up to the sound of my alarm, not because I had to, but because that's when mothers wake up. I'd pad downstairs in my worn slippers, past the family photos that lined the hallway like a shrine to everyone else's achievements. Sarah's college graduation, David's wedding, Michael's high school football team. Not a single photo of me alone, just me standing behind someone else, smiling that practiced smile I'd perfected over decades. The kitchen was my domain, with its granite countertops that I'd lobbied for during our renovation 10 years ago. The only time Robert had actually listened to my opinion about our home. I'd start the coffee, check the weather on my phone, and begin planning everyone else's day. Robert needed his blood pressure medication with breakfast. Sarah would call around 8 a.m. complaining about something. David would text, asking me to pick up his dry cleaning because his assistant was out sick. Michael would stumble down around noon, expecting lunch to be ready. I became an expert at anticipating needs before they were even voiced. I knew Robert liked his eggs over easy, but not runny, that Sarah preferred her coffee with oat milk. Last month it was almond, that David needed his shirts pressed with extra starch, and that Michael would eat anything as long as it didn't require him to actually ask for it. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday, I was the one planning, cooking, cleaning, and smiling, while everyone else enjoyed themselves. My daughter Sarah would show up with store-bought dessert and act like she'd moved mountains. She'd breeze through the door in her designer coat, kiss my cheek with her perfectly glossed lips, and immediately start complaining about traffic or her husband or her job. Never once asking how I was, what I'd been doing, or if I needed help with the feast I'd been preparing for days. My son David would grunt his thanks between checking his phone for stock updates. He'd inherited his father's emotional distance, but none of his work ethic. At 35, he still expected me to remember his preferences, his schedule, his needs. He'd sit at my table, eating my food, and discuss his business deals like I was furniture, present, but not really there. And my youngest, Michael, would barely look up from his video games long enough to acknowledge the feast I'd prepared. At 28, he still lived in his childhood bedroom, still expected me to do his laundry, still treated me like hired help rather than the woman who'd given him life. But tonight feels different. Tonight, as the autumn wind rattles the windows and the smell of my homemade apple pie fills the air, I can feel something shifting. The letter in my purse seems to pulse with a secret energy, and I know that everything is about to change in ways they could never imagine. The dining room glows with warm light from the chandelier I'd picked out 20 years ago. The table is set with the good china, the set I'd inherited from my own mother and had used maybe a dozen times in 4 decades because it was too nice for every day. Tonight feels like it deserves the good china, though I can't quite explain why. The humiliation started, as it always does, with something small. Sarah was complaining about her mortgage payments, dramatically sighing as she cut into the roast beef I'd spent all day preparing. The meat was perfect, tender, seasoned with the herb blend I'd been perfecting for years, but she barely noticed. "Mom, you just don't understand modern expenses," she said, not even looking at me. Her manicured nails clicked against her wine glass as she gestured dismissively. "Everything costs so much more now. My grocery bill alone is ridiculous, and don't get me started on the kids' activities." I wanted to remind her that I'd raised 3 children on a single income while her father built his practice, that I knew exactly what it meant to stretch a dollar. But I stayed quiet, as I always did. David and I were talking. "When Dad retires, you two should really consider downsizing. This house is way too big, and honestly, the property taxes are ridiculous." I felt my fork freeze halfway to my mouth. The roast beef suddenly tasted like cardboard. "Downsizing?" "Well, yeah," David chimed in, his voice carrying that condescending tone he'd perfected in business school. He'd learned to speak to people like they were slightly slow, and apparently that included his own mother. You and Dad are getting older. You don't need all this space. Plus, if you sold this place, you could help us out financially. The words hit me like a physical blow. This house, with its memories embedded in every wall, its garden that I'd cultivated from nothing, its rooms where I'd nursed sick children and celebrated milestones, was just real estate to them, square footage to be liquidated. Sarah's got the kids' college funds to think about, David continued, cutting his meat with precise movements. And I'm trying to expand my practice. The startup costs are enormous. My husband nodded along like a bobblehead, as he always did when the children spoke. 43 years of marriage, and he still couldn't find his backbone when it came to them. Robert had built a successful accounting firm, commanded respect from clients and colleagues, but turned into a passive observer whenever our children entered the room. We've already looked at some nice senior communities, Sarah continued, pulling out her phone to show me pictures. Her screen displayed sterile-looking buildings with names like Golden Years Manor and Sunset Village. Look, they have bingo nights and everything. You'd love it there, Mom. Much more appropriate for someone your age. The words hit me like ice water. Someone my age, as if I was already dead and just hadn't realized it yet. As if the woman who had sacrificed everything for this family was now just an inconvenient elderly person taking up too much space. The one in West Hartford has a lovely dining room, Sarah added, swiping through photos. You wouldn't have to cook anymore. Think of how relaxing that would be. Relaxing. They thought cooking was a burden I'd been carrying, rather than one of the few creative outlets I'd had in decades. They didn't understand that my kitchen was where I felt most myself, where I could create something beautiful and nourishing from simple ingredients. And the social activities would be perfect for you, David added. You'd be around people your own age, with similar interests. Similar interests. What did they think my interests were? Complaining about arthritis and watching game shows? They'd lived in my house for decades, but had never bothered to learn who I actually was beyond their personal chef and housekeeper. I excused myself to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I gripped the granite countertop. The familiar space that had been my sanctuary now felt like a museum exhibit. Here's where the old lady used to cook before we shipped her off to play bingo. Through the doorway, I could hear them continuing to plan my life without me, discussing my future, like I was a piece of furniture they needed to relocate. Their voices carried that casual certainty of people who'd never been told no, who'd never had to fight for anything, because everything had always been provided for them. What would you do in my place? Would you speak up, or would you let them keep talking while you held on to the secret that could change everything? The days following that dinner felt like walking through fog. Every morning, I'd wake up in the king-sized bed I'd shared with Robert for decades, and the first thing I'd think about was that conversation. Someone your age. The words echoed in my head as I made coffee in the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals, as I watered the garden I'd cultivated for 20 years. The house felt different now, like I was seeing it through their eyes instead of my own. The living room where I'd rocked babies to sleep became wasted space. The dining room where we'd celebrated holidays became too formal for everyday use. My sewing room, the one space that was truly mine, became that cluttered room upstairs that could be converted. I started noticing things I'd been blind to before. How Sarah would call only when she needed something. A babysitter, a loan, or someone to listen to her complain about her husband. Her voice would change when she wanted something, becoming sweeter, more daughterly. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" she'd start, but I could hear the request coming before she even made it. How David would visit and immediately start calculating the value of our antiques with his eyes. He'd run his fingers along the mahogany sideboard that had belonged to my grandmother, or study the oil painting we'd bought on our honeymoon in Europe. I'd catch him taking photos of things when he thought I wasn't looking. How Michael, at 28, still expected me to do his laundry when he came home, treating me like hired help rather than his mother. He'd drop his dirty clothes outside his old bedroom door like he was still 16, never saying please or thank you, just assuming I'd handle it because I always had. But the worst part was Robert. My husband of 4 decades had sat there, nodding along as our children planned to ship me off to some sterile senior community. Not once did he defend me. Not once did he say, "This is Margaret's home too, and she deserves a voice in this decision." I found myself studying him during breakfast, this man I'd shared my life with. When had he stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as just another household responsibility? When had I become someone whose opinions didn't matter, whose feelings didn't need to be considered? I found myself taking longer walks around our neighborhood, past the other colonial houses with their perfectly maintained lawns. The October air was crisp, filled with the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. I'd wave to neighbors who saw me as Robert's wife or the kid's mother, never just Margaret. Mrs. Henderson from 2 houses down would smile and ask about the children, never asking about me. Mr. Peterson would nod politely and ask if Robert was enjoying retirement planning, as if I was just a messenger service. I was 67 years old, and I felt like I'd never really existed as my own person. I'd been defined by my relationships to others for so long that I'd forgotten I was someone independent of them. The letter from Grandma Rose's attorney stayed in my purse, a secret weight that grew heavier each day. Sometimes I'd take it out and read it again, just to make sure it was real. $900,000, money that Grandma Rose had specifically left to me, not to the family, not to be divided among the children, to me. Grandma Rose had been the strongest woman I'd ever known. She'd raised 5 children during the Depression, had worked as a seamstress to help support the family, and had never let anyone make her feel small. In her final years, when she lived with us, she'd watch me bustling around the house and shake her head. "Margaret," she'd say in her firm voice, "you're disappearing into these people. Don't let them erase you." I hadn't understood what she meant then. I thought I was being a good wife, a good mother. I thought sacrifice was love. But now, holding her final gift to me, I was beginning to understand. I could feel something building inside me, a quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. They wanted to treat me like I was invisible? Fine. But invisible people can move through the world in ways that others never see coming. The decision came to me on a Tuesday morning while I was folding Robert's shirts, the same way I'd been folding them for 43 years. I looked at those perfectly pressed collars and realized I was done being the woman who disappeared into other people's needs. I'd been standing in our bedroom, the morning light streaming through the windows I'd chosen when we redecorated 15 years ago. The room was decorated in soft blues and creams, colors I'd selected because they were calming, peaceful. But looking at it now, I realized it wasn't peaceful at all. It was invisible, safe, forgettable. I set down Robert's shirt and walked to my dresser, where I kept the letter hidden beneath my jewelry box. $900,000. The number still seemed surreal, like something from someone else's life, but it was real, and it was mine. I drove to downtown Hartford to the law office where Grandma Rose's attorney had been waiting for my response. The city buzzed with October energy, leaves turning brilliant reds and golds, people in wool coats hurrying past the historic brownstones. I felt more alive than I had in years. The law office was in one of those beautiful old buildings that Hartford was famous for, with high ceilings and original hardwood floors. I'd dressed carefully for this meeting, not in my usual practical clothes, but in the navy dress I'd bought for David's wedding and rarely worn since. I wanted to feel like someone who deserved $900,000. "Mrs. Thompson," the attorney smiled as I sat across from his mahogany desk. He was younger than I'd expected, probably David's age, with kind eyes and a genuine smile. "Have you decided what you'd like to do with the trust fund?" I thought about my family, probably assuming I was at the grocery store or getting my hair done, just another invisible errand in my invisible life. They had no idea I was sitting in a lawyer's office, holding the power to change everything. "I want to accept it," I said quietly. "But I need to know. Can this remain confidential?" "Absolutely. The trust was set up specifically for your discretion. Your grandmother was very clear that this was for you alone." He pulled out a thick folder. "She left specific instructions that this inheritance was not to be considered marital property or family assets. It's yours to do with as you please." As he explained the details, I learned more about Grandma Rose's intentions. She'd been watching our family dynamics for years, had seen how I was treated, how my contributions were minimized. The trust had been set up 5 years ago, after she'd moved in with us and witnessed firsthand how invisible I'd become. "She mentioned that you might need time to decide how to use this gift," the attorney said gently. "There's no rush. The money will remain in the trust until you're ready." I signed the papers with steady hands, watching as $900,000 became mine. Not the family's, not Robert's, mine. The pen felt heavy in my hand, like I was signing my Declaration of Independence. Walking back to my car, I felt the autumn air differently, The same Connecticut streets looked brighter, full of possibility. I had choices now, real choices. I could travel to all the places I'd dreamed about but never mentioned because there was never money for frivolous things. I could buy my own place, somewhere that reflected my taste, instead of compromising with everyone else's opinions. I could finally live for Margaret instead of everyone else. But first, I had some planning to do. If my family wanted to treat me like I was already gone, then maybe it was time to show them what my absence would really look like. I stopped at a small cafe I'd never been to before, ordered a cappuccino, and sat by the window watching people walk by. For the first time in decades, I had nowhere I needed to be, no one expecting me to have dinner ready or laundry folded. I was just Margaret, sitting in a cafe with $900,000 and a future full of possibilities. What would you do with this kind of freedom? Would you tell them immediately? Or would you wait for the perfect moment to reveal how wrong they'd been about everything? The next few weeks were the most exhilarating of my life. While my family continued their casual discussions about Mom's future, I was quietly building my own. I started small, but with purpose. A financial advisor who specialized in women's wealth management. A sharp woman named Patricia who understood exactly what it meant to suddenly have control over your own financial destiny. She didn't talk down to me or assume I knew nothing about money. Instead, she listened as I explained my situation and helped me understand my options. The beautiful thing about this inheritance, Patricia said during our second meeting, is that it gives you complete independence. You can make choices based on what you want, not what others expect from you. I also found a real estate agent who showed me charming condos in Boston and cozy cottages in Vermont. Each property represented a different version of the life I could choose. The Boston condo was sophisticated, urban, close to museums and theaters I'd always wanted to visit. The Vermont cottage was peaceful, surrounded by gardens I could tend without anyone telling me what to plant. I even looked at a beautiful apartment in Manhattan, something I'd dreamed about since I was young but never thought possible. The realtor, an energetic woman named Carmen, showed me a one-bedroom with huge windows overlooking Central Park. This would be perfect for someone starting a new chapter, she said. And I realized she was talking about me. Not someone's wife or mother, but someone beginning her own story. The irony was delicious. Sarah called me twice that week to complain about money, never knowing that I was sitting on more cash than she'd see in 5 years. She'd go on about her mortgage payment, her car repairs, her children's expensive activities, all while I nodded sympathetically and made appropriate sounds of concern. I just don't know how we're going to manage, she'd sigh dramatically. Maybe when you and Dad sell the house, you could help us out with Emma's orthodontist bills. I'd listen to these conversations with a new sense of detachment. It was fascinating how differently people treated you when they thought you had nothing to offer versus when they thought you might be useful to them. David stopped by to check on me, his eyes still doing that calculating sweep of our valuables, completely unaware that I no longer needed anything he thought he could inherit. He'd comment on how well I was maintaining the house, how the antiques were holding their value, how the neighborhood was really appreciating. "You know, Mom," he said one afternoon, running his hand along the dining room table, "when you do decide to downsize, I'd be happy to help you get fair market value for some of these pieces. I know a guy who specializes in estate sales." Estate sales, as if I was already dead. I found myself smiling more, humming while I cooked. The kitchen that had felt like a prison now felt like my laboratory, where I could experiment with recipes I'd always wanted to try but never had because someone might not like them. I made Thai curry because I loved it, even though Robert thought it was too spicy. I baked a lemon tart because it made me happy, even though Michael preferred chocolate. Robert noticed the change in me. "You seem different lately," he said one evening, looking up from his newspaper. "Happier? Do I?" I replied, setting down his coffee exactly the way he liked it. Maybe it's just the fall weather. But inside, I was practically glowing. I had a secret that was reshaping everything. I wasn't just the family caretaker anymore. I was a woman with options, with power, with the ability to choose her own path. The real test came when Sarah called with her latest crisis. Her car needed expensive repairs, and she was hoping Mom and Dad could help out, just this once. The old Margaret would have immediately offered to dip into our savings, would have worried about her daughter's stress, would have found a way to fix the problem. The new Margaret simply said, "That sounds stressful, honey. I'm sure you'll figure something out." The silence on the other end was telling. Sarah wasn't used to me not immediately offering solutions to her problems. "Well," she said finally, "I thought maybe you could talk to Dad about it. You're a grown woman, Sarah. If you need to discuss finances with your father, you can do that yourself." Another silence. Then, "Are you feeling okay, Mom? You sound different." "I feel fine," I said, and for the first time in years, it was completely true. I was learning to enjoy these moments of quiet power. They thought they knew me so well, thought they could predict exactly how I'd react to everything. But people who take you for granted never really see you at all. And soon, very soon, they were going to discover just how wrong they'd been about their invisible mother. The moment I'd been waiting for arrived on a cold November evening, 3 weeks after I'd signed the trust papers. Sarah had organized what she called a family meeting, code for, "Let's pressure Mom and Dad into doing what we want." They all gathered in my living room, the same room where I'd read bedtime stories, nursed them through illnesses, and celebrated their achievements. Now they sat there like a tribunal, ready to decide my fate. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd arranged themselves on the furniture I'd chosen, in the room I'd decorated, discussing my future like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person with agency. The evening had started with the usual pleasantries. Sarah brought store-bought cookies, David arrived with his briefcase full of research, and Michael actually showed up on time for once. Robert had spent the afternoon nervously adjusting his tie and asking if I thought we should serve coffee. Even he could sense that something significant was about to happen. "Mom, Dad," Sarah began, her voice taking on that fake sweet tone she used when she wanted something big. "We've been doing some research, and we found the perfect place for you." She pulled out a glossy brochure for Meadowbrook Senior Living Community. The cover showed elderly people playing cards and smiling at cameras, looking like actors in a pharmaceutical commercial. The images were carefully curated. No wheelchairs, no confusion, no reality of what aging actually looked like for most people. "It's only 20 minutes away," David added, leaning forward in his chair with the intensity he usually reserved for business presentations. "You'd have your own apartment, but with all the services you need. Housekeeping, meals, activities. Think of it as luxury living without the responsibility." I noticed how he framed it. Luxury, not exile. Services, not loss of independence. They'd clearly rehearsed this presentation, probably over dinner at some restaurant where they'd planned my future without me. "And the best part," Michael chimed in, finally looking up from his phone, "is that it's way more affordable than maintaining this big house. You guys are spending a fortune on property taxes and utilities." "The heating bill alone last winter was insane." Robert nodded along, as always. "It does sound practical," he said weakly, not meeting my eyes. I wondered if he'd been part of their planning sessions, or if he was just going along to avoid conflict, as he'd done for decades. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one I'd bought with my own money 15 years ago, the only piece of furniture in the house that was truly mine, and listened to them plan my exile. They had charts showing the cost savings, lists of amenities I'd supposedly love, and even a timeline for when I should start packing. Sarah had clearly done her homework. She knew the square footage of our house, the current market value, the projected sale price. She'd calculated how much money would be left after paying off the mortgage, how that money could be better utilized to benefit everyone. She spoke about my life like it was a business transaction. "We've already put you on the waiting list," Sarah announced proudly, pulling out another folder. "There's an opening in March. That gives us 4 months to get the house ready for sale. I've already contacted a realtor who specializes in estate properties. Estate properties, the language of death, applied to my very much alive situation. David knows a staging company that can help make the house more appealing to buyers," she continued, "and Michael can help with the heavy lifting when it's time to pack." That's when I stood up. The room fell silent, probably because I'd never interrupted one of their presentations before. In 43 years of family meetings, I'd always been the listener, the nodder, the woman who absorbed everyone else's decisions and made them work. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said calmly, walking to the mantelpiece where I kept my purse. My voice was steady, but my heart was pounding with the anticipation of what I was about to do. I pulled out the letter from Grandma Rose's attorney, the one I'd been carrying like a talisman for weeks. The paper rustled in the sudden quiet of the room, and I could feel all their eyes on me. 3 weeks ago, I inherited $900,000 from your great-grandmother's trust fund. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's mouth literally fell open, her carefully applied lipstick making a perfect O of shock. David's eyes went wide, and for once, he wasn't calculating. He was stunned. Michael actually put down his phone, which might have been the first time in years he'd given me his full attention. 900, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. $1,000, I finished, savoring each word. Money that Grandma Rose left specifically to me. Not to the family, not to be divided among you children. To me. I watched their faces change as the implications sank in. The careful calculations they'd made, the assumptions about my financial dependence, the certainty that they held all the power. Everything shifted in that moment. Robert stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Margaret, why didn't you tell me? Because, I said, feeling stronger with every word. For the first time in 43 years, I wanted to make a decision about my own life without having to justify it to anyone. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd tended for decades. The November evening was crisp and clear, and I could see the bare branches of the oak tree I'd planted when Sarah was born. That tree had grown strong and tall, just like I was learning to do. You want to know what I've decided? I'm keeping this house. I'm keeping my life exactly as it is. And if any of you have financial problems, you can solve them yourselves. The explosion of voices that followed was exactly what I'd expected, but somehow more intense than I'd imagined. Sarah started crying. Not sad tears, but angry ones, the kind she'd cried as a child when she didn't get her way. How could you keep this from us? We're your family, she sobbed, her carefully composed presentation dissolving into raw emotion. David was pacing, his business mind clearly racing through new calculations. Mom, you need to think about this rationally. That money could be invested, could grow, you could help all of us, and still have plenty left over. There are tax implications to consider, estate planning issues. We've been worried about you, Sarah added, her voice rising to a pitch that made the windows seem to vibrate. We thought you needed help, needed to be taken care of. We were trying to do what was best for you. No, I said firmly, my voice cutting through their protests like a knife through butter. You thought I was a burden. You thought I was too old, too useless to make my own decisions. You wanted to ship me off to play bingo so you could sell my home and divide the proceeds. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. They couldn't deny it, because it was exactly what they'd been planning. Down to the realtor Sarah had already contacted. And you, I turned to Robert, feeling decades of suppressed anger finally finding its voice, sat there and let them. 43 years of marriage, and you couldn't even defend my right to stay in my own home. Robert's face was red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. Margaret, you should have discussed this with me. We're married, we make decisions together. Like the decision to put me in assisted living? When exactly were you planning to ask my opinion about that? The room erupted again, everyone talking at once, voices overlapping in a cacophony of anger, shock, and desperate attempts to regain control. But I was done listening. I'd spent decades absorbing their voices, their needs, their demands. Tonight, they could absorb mine. What would you do in my place? Would you have revealed the secret, or would you have let them keep planning your life without you? The aftermath of that evening was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Within days, everything in my family had shifted, and not in the ways any of us had expected. The house that had always been filled with the comfortable rhythms of family life now felt like a battlefield where everyone was choosing sides. Sarah stopped speaking to me entirely, which was perhaps the most telling reaction of all. For someone who claimed to love me and worry about my well-being, she certainly had no trouble cutting me out of her life the moment I stopped being useful to her plans. She'd call Robert instead, crying about how hurt she was, how she couldn't believe I'd betrayed the family by keeping the inheritance secret. The conversations between Sarah and Robert became a daily occurrence, usually happening in the evening when he thought I was upstairs reading. But sound carries in our old house, and I could hear every word of her manipulation through the heating vents. Dad, you have to talk to her, Sarah would plead, her voice taking on that little girl quality she'd perfected decades ago. This isn't like Mom. Someone must be influencing her. Maybe she's getting dementia and doesn't realize what she's doing. Dementia. Because a woman making her own financial decisions was clearly a sign of mental decline. She painted herself as the victim, conveniently forgetting that she'd been planning to sell my home without my consent. In her version of events, she was the devoted daughter who'd only wanted what was best for her aging parents, and I was the selfish mother who'd cruelly deceived her loving family. "She's really struggling, Margaret," Robert would say after these calls, his voice pleading in that way that meant he wanted me to fix the problem so he wouldn't have to deal with the emotional fallout. "Maybe you could just help with Emma's orthodontist bills. It would mean so much to her." But I'd learned something powerful in those weeks since discovering my financial independence. I didn't have to fix everyone else's problems anymore. I didn't have to be the family's emotional janitor, cleaning up messes and soothing hurt feelings and making everything comfortable for everyone else. "Sarah is 35 years old," I'd remind him. "She has a husband, a career, and a college education. If she can't figure out how to pay for her daughter's dental work, that's not my failure as a mother." The conversations with Robert were becoming increasingly strained. He'd look at me like I was speaking a foreign language, genuinely confused by my refusal to immediately solve everyone's problems with my newfound wealth. David took a different approach entirely, one that was somehow more insulting than Sarah's emotional manipulation. He showed up at my door with flowers and that charming smile he'd inherited from his father, the one that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5 years old. "Mom, I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said, settling into my kitchen like he owned it, his expensive suit and confident demeanor filling the space with masculine authority. "I want you to know that I think it's wonderful that Grandma Rose left you that money. You deserve it." I poured him coffee in the mug he'd used as a child, the one with his name painted in bright blue letters that had faded over the years. I waited for the real conversation to begin, knowing David well enough to recognize when he was building up to something. "The thing is," he continued, adding cream to his coffee with the precise movements he'd learned in business school, "I've been thinking about investment opportunities. With that kind of capital, you could really make it grow. I know some people, some really solid investments that could double your money in a few years." There it was. David wasn't angry about the money. He wanted to manage it. In his mind, I was still the same financially naive woman who'd let Robert handle all our investments for decades. The idea that I might be capable of making my own financial decisions was as foreign to him as the idea that I might want to. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I've already hired a financial advisor." His smile faltered slightly, and I could see him recalculating his approach. "Oh, well, I hope you were careful about who you chose. There are a lot of people out there who take advantage of older investors." Older investors. Another way of saying I was too naive to handle my own money, too vulnerable to make smart choices, too old to understand the complexities of modern finance. "Patricia comes highly recommended," I said calmly. "She specializes in helping women manage sudden wealth." The phrase, sudden wealth, seemed to hit David like a physical blow. He'd spent his entire adult life building his financial practice, working 60-hour weeks to accumulate what I'd inherited in a single afternoon. The unfairness of it was clearly eating at him. "Mom, I just want to make sure you're protected. Families should look out for each other." "I agree," I said, "which is why I'm disappointed that none of you looked out for me when you were planning to sell my home." Michael's reaction was the most honest, which surprised me more than anything else that had happened in those chaotic weeks. He came home from whatever job he was pretending to look for and found me in the kitchen making dinner, not because anyone expected it, but because I enjoyed cooking when it was my choice rather than my obligation. "So," he said, leaning against the counter with the casual posture of someone who'd never had to worry about paying rent or buying groceries, "you're rich now." "I have some financial security," I corrected, appreciating his directness after days of Sarah's tears and David's manipulation. He nodded slowly, processing this information in his straightforward way. "Good for you, Mom. Seriously, I always thought it was messed up how they talked about you like you weren't even here." It was the first time in years that Michael had acknowledged me as a person rather than a service provider, and the validation meant more than I'd expected. "Does this mean you're not moving to that old people place?" he asked. "I'm staying right here." "Cool. Can I stay too?" I looked at my youngest son, 28 years old and still living in his childhood bedroom, still expecting me to do his laundry and cook his meals and clean up after him like he was still 16. The old Margaret would have said yes immediately, would have been grateful that at least one of her children wanted to stay close. The new Margaret said, "You can stay until the end of the year. After that, you need to find your own place." His eyes widened in genuine shock. "Mom, I can't afford my own place. You know how expensive rent is. Then you'll need to figure out how to make more money, won't you?" The conversation I'd been avoiding with Robert finally happened on a Tuesday night in late November. We were sitting in our bedroom, the same room where we'd shared 43 years of marriage, and he looked at me like I was a stranger who'd somehow taken over his wife's body. "I don't understand what's happened to you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and hurt that made me feel guilty for the first time since this whole situation began. "I've stopped disappearing," I replied. "There's a difference. The children are upset. Sarah won't even come for Thanksgiving. Sarah is upset because she can't control me anymore. None of you can." Robert was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "I never tried to control you, Margaret." "No," I agreed, feeling the weight of 4 decades of marriage in that single word. "You just never tried to protect me either. When they talked about shipping me off to assisted living, you nodded along. When they discussed selling my home, you thought it sounded practical. You've been married to me for over 4 decades, and you couldn't even stand up for my right to have a voice in my own life." He looked genuinely confused, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been defensive or angry. "I thought you'd be happy not to have to maintain such a big house anymore. Did you ever ask me what I wanted? In 43 years of marriage, when was the last time you asked me what I wanted instead of assuming you knew?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been there for years, but was only now visible, because we both knew the answer was never. The house felt different now, quieter, but not empty. For the first time in decades, I could hear my own thoughts without the constant background noise of other people's needs and expectations. I was learning to live with the consequences of my choices, and surprisingly, I liked the woman I was becoming. Thanksgiving arrived like a storm I'd been watching approach for weeks. Dark clouds gathering on the horizon of family tradition. For the first time in 43 years, I wasn't cooking for a crowd. The kitchen that had always been a battlefield of preparation in the days leading up to the holiday was peaceful, almost eerily quiet. Sarah had made good on her threat and was spending the holiday with her in-laws, taking Emma and little James with her. I'd received a terse text message informing me of this decision, as if my grandchildren were weapons she could deploy in our ongoing war. David was too busy to come, claiming a last-minute business trip that I suspected was invented to avoid the awkwardness of family dinner. Michael was sulking because I'd given him a move-out date, spending most of his time in his room playing video games with the volume turned up loud enough to rattle the walls. It was just Robert and me, sitting at the dining room table that had hosted decades of family gatherings, eating a simple meal I'd prepared for 2. The table looked enormous with just our 2-place settings, the empty chairs around us like ghosts of holidays past. "This feels wrong," Robert said, cutting into his turkey with mechanical precision. "The house is too quiet." "It feels peaceful to me," I replied, and I meant it. For the first time in decades, I wasn't exhausted from days of preparation, wasn't stressed about timing multiple dishes, wasn't worried about whether everyone would be happy with the menu I'd chosen. The turkey was perfectly cooked, the stuffing seasoned exactly to my taste, the cranberry sauce made from my grandmother's recipe. I'd prepared everything I wanted to eat, not everything I thought other people expected. But the real confrontation came the next day, when Sarah showed up unannounced, with tears in her eyes and desperation in her voice. I was in my garden, enjoying the mild November afternoon and planning what I'd plant in the spring, when I heard her car in the driveway. "Mom, I need to talk to you," she said, pushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. She looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, and she had the frantic energy of someone who'd been awake all night rehearsing this conversation. The Sarah who walked into my house that day was different from the composed woman who'd presented her assisted living brochures just weeks earlier. This Sarah was raw, desperate, stripped of the careful control she usually maintained. "Emma needs surgery," she blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in her haste to get them out. "Her orthodontist found something wrong with her jaw alignment. It's going to cost $30,000, and insurance won't cover it." My heart clenched involuntarily. Emma was my granddaughter, innocent in all of this family drama, a sweet 10-year-old who still hugged me tight when she saw me and asked me to read her stories when she visited. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully, fighting every maternal instinct that screamed at me to immediately offer to help. "That must be very stressful." "Mom, please," Sarah's voice broke, and I could see the little girl she'd once been underneath the desperate woman she'd become. I know you're angry with me, but this is about Emma. She's your granddaughter. You can't punish her because you're mad at me." There it was, the manipulation I'd been expecting, delivered with surgical precision. Make it about the child, make me the villain if I didn't immediately open my wallet. It was the same tactic she'd used as a teenager when she wanted something, the same emotional blackmail that had worked for decades. "I'm not punishing anyone," I said calmly, settling into my armchair and gesturing for her to sit down. "But your daughter's medical needs don't automatically become my financial responsibility." Sarah remained standing, pacing back and forth across my living room like a caged animal. "She's your granddaughter, and she's your daughter. You're her parent. It's your job to figure out how to take care of her. But you have the money. You're sitting on $900,000 while your granddaughter suffers." The accusation hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the moment when my love for my grandchildren would be weaponized against me. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. "3 months ago, you wanted to put me in assisted living so you could sell my house and use the money for your own needs. You didn't care about my feelings, my wishes, or my right to stay in my own home. You saw me as an inconvenience to be managed." Her face flushed red, and I could see her struggling between anger and the desperate need to get what she'd come for. "That's not... We were trying to help you." "No, you were trying to help yourselves. You had already contacted a realtor, already calculated how much money you'd get from selling my home, already decided how to divide it among yourselves. And now that you know I have money, suddenly I'm important again. Suddenly my opinion matters. Suddenly you want to spend time with me. But only because you want something." Sarah started crying. Real tears this time, not the manipulative ones she'd used as a child. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled, and I could see the fear underneath. "I'm scared, Mom. I don't know how to pay for this surgery. Tom's business is struggling, and we're already behind on the mortgage. I've looked into payment plans, but they want a huge down payment we don't have." For a moment, I felt the old pull, the maternal instinct to fix everything, to sacrifice myself for my children's comfort. The urge to write a check and make all the problems disappear was almost overwhelming. But then I remembered sitting at this same table while they planned my future without me. "Have you talked to Tom's parents?" I asked. "They don't have that kind of money. Have you looked into medical loans? The interest rates are terrible. Have you considered getting a second job?" Sarah stared at me like I'd suggested she rob a bank. "Mom, I already work full-time. When would I have time for a second job?" The same way millions of other parents manage when their children need expensive medical care. "You find a way. I'll tell you what I told your brothers," I said gently but firmly. "You're a grown woman. You have a husband, a career, and resources of your own. Figure it out." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. And maybe she was. The mother she'd known, the one who solved problems and absorbed stress and sacrificed herself for everyone else's comfort, was gone. "I can't believe you're doing this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What happened to you? You used to care about your family." "I still care about my family," I replied, feeling the weight of every word. "But I also care about myself now. And I've learned that the two don't have to be mutually exclusive." She left without another word, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. I stood at the window and watched her drive away, her car disappearing around the corner with a screech of tires that spoke to her emotional state. I remained at that window for a long time, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief that was almost overwhelming. The mother in me wanted to run after her, to call her back and write the check that would solve everything. But the woman I was becoming knew that solving this problem would only create bigger ones. Robert found me there an hour later, still looking out at the empty driveway where Sarah's car had been. "She called me," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of family drama he'd never learned to navigate. "She's very upset." "I imagine she is." "Margaret, maybe we could help just this once. For Emma's sake." I turned to look at my husband, this man who still didn't understand what had changed, who still thought money was the solution to every problem, who still believed that my role was to make everyone else's life easier. "Robert," I said, "if I give Sarah $30,000 today, what happens next month when David needs money for his business expansion? What happens when Michael decides he wants to go back to school? What happens when you decide we should renovate the kitchen or take that cruise you've been talking about? He looked confused, as if the connection between these scenarios wasn't obvious. We'd discuss it. No, you'd assume it. You'd all assume that because I have money, your problems become my problems. You'd assume that because I'm your wife and their mother, I exist to make your lives easier. The truth of it settled over him slowly, like dust settling after an explosion. I could see the moment he understood what I was really saying, the moment he realized that this wasn't just about Sarah's request. I've spent 43 years being everyone's solution, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I'm done with that job. What would you do in my place? Would you have given in to help your granddaughter, or would you have held firm to your boundaries? 6 months later, I'm sitting in my garden on a warm May morning, drinking coffee from my favorite mug and watching the roses I planted 20 years ago bloom in spectacular abundance. The house behind me is quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine in a way it never was before. The garden has become my sanctuary, a place where I can think clearly about the journey that brought me here. The roses are particularly beautiful this year, full, fragrant, and absolutely perfect. I planted them as a young mother, tended them through decades of family chaos, and now I get to enjoy them as a woman who finally knows her own worth. Michael moved out in January, just as I'd required. To everyone's surprise, including his own, he found a job at a local tech company and a small apartment across town. The transition wasn't easy. He'd never had to manage his own finances, do his own laundry, or cook his own meals. But necessity proved to be an excellent teacher. He calls me once a week now, not to ask for anything, but just to talk. Our conversations are different than they've ever been, built on respect rather than dependency. He tells me about his work, his attempts at cooking, his growing independence. I tell him about my art classes, my travel plans, my quiet contentment. I never realized how much I was taking advantage of you, he said during one of our recent conversations. Living at home was easy, but it wasn't helping me grow up. Our relationship is better than it's been in years, perhaps better than it's ever been. When he visits now, it's because he wants to see me, not because he needs something from me. David still tries occasionally to involve me in his business ventures, but he's learned to accept my polite refusals with something approaching grace. He's also learned to call before visiting and to ask about my life instead of just assuming I exist to serve his needs. Last month, he brought his wife and children for Sunday dinner, not because I'd cooked for them, but because we'd ordered takeout together and eaten it at my kitchen table while the kids played in the backyard. It was casual, relaxed, and completely different from the formal family gatherings of the past. "You seem happier, Mom," he said, as we watched his children chase butterflies in my garden. "More yourself." It was perhaps the most perceptive thing he'd ever said to me. Sarah and I are still working through our relationship, but we're making progress. The surgery for Emma was eventually covered by a combination of a payment plan, help from Tom's parents, and Sarah taking on freelance work in the evenings. It was a hard lesson in resourcefulness, but a necessary one. Emma's surgery went well, and her recovery was faster than expected. When Sarah brought her to visit last week, Emma hugged me tight and thanked me for the art supplies I'd sent to help her through her recovery. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to both of us. Sarah came to see me last month, not to ask for money, but to apologize. She sat in my kitchen, where we'd had so many conversations over the years, looking older and perhaps wiser than she had 6 months earlier. "I never realized how we treated you," she said, her voice quiet and thoughtful. "I thought we were just family. I thought that's how families worked." "Some families," I replied, "but not healthy ones. We're rebuilding slowly, learning to relate to each other as adults rather than as parent and dependent child. It's harder work than I expected, but more rewarding too. Sarah is discovering that she's more capable than she ever imagined, and I'm discovering that I can love my children without sacrificing myself for them. Robert and I are also finding our way to something new. The man who nodded along when our children planned my exile has been replaced by someone who actually asks my opinion about things, real questions, not just polite inquiries. He started joining me for my morning coffee in the garden, something he never did in all our years of marriage. We talk about books, about travel plans, about the small daily pleasures we'd both overlooked for decades. "I'm sorry I didn't see it," he said one morning, watching me tend to my roses. How invisible you'd become, how invisible I'd made you. It was the apology I'd been waiting 43 years to hear. We're planning a trip to Europe this fall, not the practical, budget-conscious vacation we might have taken before, but a luxurious journey to all the places I've dreamed of seeing. We'll stay in beautiful hotels, eat at wonderful restaurants, and visit museums and galleries without worrying about the cost. The money from Grandma Rose's trust has given me more than financial security. It's given me the power to choose. I've traveled to places I'd only dreamed about, taken art classes I'd always wanted to try, and bought books simply because they interested me, not because they were practical or educational. I've learned to paint watercolors, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. My instructor, a woman about my age who started painting after her own children left home, understands the joy of discovering creativity later in life. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be, she said during one of our sessions. And I knew she was speaking from experience. But the most valuable thing I've gained is something money can't buy: respect. My family no longer takes me for granted because I've shown them that I won't accept being taken for granted. They've learned to see me as a person with my own needs, desires, and boundaries. I think about Grandma Rose often, especially when I'm sitting in this garden she helped me plant. She knew exactly what she was doing when she set up that trust fund. She wasn't just giving me money, she was giving me the tools to reclaim my life. In her final years when she lived with us, she'd watch me bustling around the house and shake her head. "Margaret," she'd say in her firm voice, "you're disappearing into these people. Don't let them erase you." I hadn't understood what she meant then. I thought I was being a good wife, a good mother. I thought sacrifice was love. But now, holding her final gift to me, I understand that love without respect isn't love at all. It's servitude. The woman who sat at that dining room table 8 months ago, listening to her children plan her exile, feels like a stranger to me now. That woman was invisible, voiceless, existing only in relation to other people's needs. This woman, the one sitting in her own garden, drinking coffee from her favorite mug, planning her own day according to her own desires, this woman is finally, fully alive. I've learned that it's never too late to stop disappearing. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to choose yourself. The greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the courage to become who you were always meant to be. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Grandma Rose hadn't left me that trust fund. Would I have ended up in Meadowbrook Senior Living Community, playing bingo and pretending to be grateful for my children's generosity? Would I have spent my remaining years as a ghost in someone else's idea of what my life should be? But then I remember that the money was just a tool. The real change came from within, from finally understanding that I deserved better than invisibility. The trust fund gave me options, but I had to choose to use them. Now, as I sit surrounded by the roses I planted and tended, in the house I chose to keep, living the life I decided to claim, I know that I made the right choice. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to matter. The end.